You must be the Belmont.
The Metroidvania's influence in the gaming industry, with the creation of influential titles like Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, cannot be overstated. Super Metroid is considered a perfected evolution of the formula that was popularized with the original Metroid, and Symphony of the Night could be seen as the first attempt for Castlevania to fully step into the 2D action exploration world, although Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest could be argued as being a prototype for what we now know as the modern Castlevania style. Simon's Quest was the first to include an XP system and is a mainstay mechanic for the series as well as many future Metroidvanias and other inspired games. If this information sounds obvious, it is for us fans of the genre, but the importance of the Metroidvania in 2024 needs to be made clear before I tell you why that title is losing its meaning today, and why that isn't a bad thing. Narrel has a wonderful collection of videos talking about different popular Metroidvania games, and it's very much worth your time if you're as interested in this topic as I am. I haven't been as into Castlevania as I am with Metroid, although I was very familiar with Super Castlevania 4, which would still be an excellent inclusion to the Switch Online collection in 2024. I've been a lifelong fan of the Metroid series, which started with Zero Mission and Metroid Prime 2 Echoes in 2004. I've played nearly every game in the franchise at this point, and given my heavily biased and objectively correct opinion, the 2D Metroid games are the absolute best of the best this genre has to offer. Whenever I play a new 2D Metroidvania today, whether on the Switch or on Steam, I always immediately compare my experience to Super Metroid, Zero Mission, and now Metroid Dread, although all three Prime games are incredible and worth your time as well. I've always had a respect and fascination with Castlevania given its status as a sister series to this genre, but until recently, most of my time spent with Castlevania revolved around the more classic level-based entries. Despite that, Castlevania's personality was so striking, from the style to the art to the music. Simon Belmont was my top choice for a newcomer for Smash Ultimate when the game was first revealed. The Castlevania Dominus Collection just released, so I've had the perfect opportunity to try out what some consider to be the very best of the series with the 3 Nintendo DS entries, and having access to them on the portable Switch feels right at home. Playing this collection, which also comes with a revamped edition of the classic arcade game Haunted Castle, has left me thinking, and way too much thinking. During my playthrough of Dawn of Sorrow for the first time, I just couldn't stop thinking. With the popularity of the Metroidvania in 2024 that's shining brightly in the indie space, why isn't a new Castlevania in development? The collection is definitely being used as a test to gauge player interest in the series, which is commonly done with releases of legacy franchises, and it makes sense given Konami's utter abandonment of most of their IP in the last decade. One of their last major franchise releases was Metal Gear Solid 5, nearly 10 years ago. For any Konami fan, the gears are turning in the right direction, as the remakes of Silent Hill 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 are releasing soon. Although Silent Hill 2 is being outsourced by Bloober Team, and we'll have to wait and see how that turns out. Most die-hard fans share the sentiment that Silent Hill 2 is impossible to remake, since so much of that game's success and quality is directly a result of the technology limitations and development mindset at the time. Despite the remakes, Castlevania is still very absent among its Konami brethren, even with a currently successful Netflix series, and like Dracula himself, is deserving of a resurrection. If you were to revitalize Castlevania with a fresh twist and perspective, there's no better ongoing, popular series to take inspiration from than From Software's Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. Exploring intricate labyrinthian-like worlds with very detailed lore, relying on constant backtracking to uncover new locations once keys and items are discovered, obtaining different weapons and upgrades to experiment with more efficiently defeating enemies, moody and inviting atmospheres with a major emphasis on subtle world building and visual storytelling rather than a traditional straightforward narrative. Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring have always felt like a modern evolution of the core principles that were popularized with Metroid and Castlevania. Castlevania being rebooted as a quick-paced 3D action platformer with inspiration from Dark Souls is a perfect match. 3D isn't a limitation of the Metroidvania. Just take a look at one of the greatest masterpieces this genre has to offer with the Prime trilogy. If you want to go even further, just look at Metroid Other M, which was a massive failure due to pacing, narrative, and abandonment of the fundamentals that made previous Metroid games games so interesting, but the transition to 3D was never the main issue. So much of Dark Souls and Elden Ring's core DNA is shared with Metroid and Castlevania that we see new titles in the indie space adopting gameplay mechanics from Dark Souls to put into their own love letters to the franchises, like Hollow Knight and Blasphemous. There's major influence and inspiration from Metroid and Castlevania for sure, but both those games take just as much from the Soulsborne series as well. The brutal difficulty in boss fights, especially in Hollow Knight's case, the Watcher Knights can forever fuck themselves. The experience and growth being directly correlated with collecting souls from every defeated enemy, rather than just gaining experience through every kill, and the darker, moody, haunting worlds that are a far cry from the older, more colorful predecessors. Metroid and Castlevania are certainly capable of darker, muted visuals, but for the most part, you'll find more vibrant color palettes compared to their Soulsborne cousins. However, the problem now lies in the diminishing of the Metroidvania due to the sheer quantity of them. There's so many Metroidvanias that are all borrowing and experimenting with different shared ideas and concepts to the point where the market is now becoming oversaturated. There are very few genres that are as influential for so many indie titles than a Metroidvania. But as time goes on and more new indies get released, some being very safe while others truly experimenting with incredible ideas and risks, it just begs the question, what is a Metroidvania? Is the Metroidvania even a genre anymore? I can't stop thinking about that name and what it truly means. The more I ask myself about games that can fit in that genre, the harder it is to define what a Metroidvania truly is. And it brings to mind two little outliers: Batman, Arkham Asylum, and Resident Evil. Both games are just as incredible and influential as Castlevania and Metroid, and they also share much of the same DNA. Both have an emphasis on exploration and backtracking to previous areas, using keys and upgrades to progress further, with different equipment upgrades and power-ups to facilitate player growth, and take place in a dark, moody, isolated location. They have a bit more linearity when it comes to their progression, given the world designs being relatively more simple in scope, but even linearity isn't a foreign concept when you look at something like Metroid Fusion. By the end of the games, much like in Metroid, the player is a force of nature with a fully equipped utility belt, or shotguns and grenade launchers that can wipe out enemies. It's not as staggering as a difference as in Metroid, where you turn into a light-speed tank, but the facilitation of growth is an important element in all these games. Many other popular franchises and games can all be traced right back to Metroid and Castlevania, but at that point, when does a game stop being a Metroidvania and start being its own thing? Is it even up to the creators themselves to determine that, or is it determined by the player? Take Dark Souls, for example. It checks many of the boxes that are shared with its predecessors, with the only major difference in being a lack of major ability-like upgrades that further enhance how the player explores and interacts with the world. For example, the horseback discovery you'll do in the first 5 hours of Elden Ring is no different to the last 5 hours, as opposed to a 2D Metroid, where you're flying and zipping around with infinite jumps. Water, lava, and the Y-axis no longer become an obstacle for the player. However, this line of thinking also applies to games like Castlevania and Hollow Knight, since both games also lack meaningful major ability upgrades that change how the player interacts with the world, and just like Dark Souls, instead rely on gradual improvements in equipment and player skill. I can only speak for the Castlevania games that I've played myself, but given my time with Symphony of the Night, Circle of the Moon, and Dawn of Sorrow, movement abilities and upgrades are not nearly as crucial as they are in Metroid. In my playthrough of Dawn of Sorrow, aside from a double jump and improved movement through water normally, I don't recall any other meaningful movement-based upgrades to exploration. 90% of the abilities and items collected are meant for finding a more efficient approach to killing enemies. It wasn't even until the last 5 minutes of the game that I received an ability that increased movement speed, which felt sorely lacking through most of this journey. This progression through the world based on major abilities and upgrades over time mostly applies to Metroid, as Hollow Knight lacks meaningful worthwhile upgrades too. In fact, it poses an existential gamer crisis and makes me wonder a little about how this genre even started in the first place. Metroid and Castlevania share a lot of similarities, but having played through a decent number of games from both franchises, I find major differences in the core structure for both of them. Metroid has regular introductions of new important weapons and abilities that are regularly used throughout your journey. Beams can stack and receive bonuses like bigger blasts, missiles can be combined with super missiles and turn into multi-hit seeker missiles, and there's all the movement upgrades like the speed booster and screw attack, which completely transform how you move in the environment. However, Metroid doesn't really care for incremental, gradual growth. The only examples of this are in health tanks and increases to your ammo count for missiles and power bombs. Castlevania operates differently when it comes to player growth, opting for experience points earned for every slain enemy, and an inventory system that's constantly growing in size with new armor pieces, weapons, and spells. Unlike in Metroid, where your abilities stack and mostly keep their relevance towards the entire journey, Castlevania is all about shuffling out different kits to find what works best for you, and what is most efficient for taking out certain enemy types. At any given time, opposite to Metroid, you're not using about 90% of the inventory you carry, much like any traditional RPG. There's much more personal player expression and choice in your build, whereas Metroid is all about having very defined abilities and weapons, and mastering them to their full extent. But the differences in the series goes beyond that. While Castlevania can have a very dark and creeping mood like Metroid, it's usually a lot more colorful and stylistic, with vibrant enemies that draws inspiration from classic horror movie monsters and tropes. Its personality is glowing. Metroid, even in its most colorful moments, still prioritizes isolating, moody horror, although it can extend to a swashbuckling, energetic adventure, similar to Metroid 2 and Zero Mission, which I believe are the brightest and most colorful journeys the series has to offer. It's very much like comparing the fusion of Dracula with Japanese anime versus a fusion of cheesy 70s sci-fi with Alien. The two series adopt different tones and personalities. Aside from 2D action platforming gameplay, with an open explorable environment that relies on backtracking, there's little else to compare the two franchises, and that's not even comparing the classic side-scrolling level-based Castlevanias. When you take away the 2D action platforming, then Castlevania, with its core mechanics and progression, resembles something like Dark Souls 3 more than it does a Metroid fusion. Hollow Knight and Blasphemous feel much more on the Castlevania side of the spectrum, given how heavily they're influenced by Dark Souls, with elements like the Souls retrieval mechanic and a greater emphasis on crushing boss fights, although both lack the general experience points from Castlevania and Dark Souls. Yet they retain a similar currency system to Dark Souls, and
how could I have been unthawed in the 90s and traveled back to, oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
then where does that leave something like Resident Evil, which doesn't offer gradual growth in the form of an experience system, but offers regular major upgrades in the form of inventory increase and powerful new weapons that feed into catharsis and the player's strength? The beginning of Resident Evil 4 is a careful game of survival, relying on smart shooting and maneuverability to survive, but by the end, Leon is a near unstoppable, fearless machine, not unlike an endgame Samus Aran, blasting through weaker enemies as if they were nothing. Metroid is the most obvious example of this idea of player growth and strength, but Resident Evil also exemplifies this, as well as highlighting the importance of player skill and knowledge, as knowing the enemies and map of a Resident Evil game is just as important as having a strong weapon. During my time with Dawn of Sorrow, most of my growth as a player came in the form of more destructive spells and incremental growth in leveling up my character's stats, but not so much in movement and gameplay changes. Understanding enemy weaknesses helped, but for much of my playthrough, I stuck with the same two weapon types, using the same vacuum spell from Persephone to increase my damage output. It wasn't until the end of my playthrough that I started receiving much more impactful abilities like the Death and Devil spells, and the Panther movement ability that acted as an equivalent to Metroid's speed booster. With Dark Souls resembling Castlevania, where most of the player growth revolves around the RPG customization, determining the best acquired spells and weapons to efficiently defeat enemies rather than relying on limited, permanent Metroid-like abilities, I have to wonder what a Metroidvania really is, because I can't quantify it in any way that makes sense. The idea behind the genre itself is flawed. Metroid and Castlevania are so different to me on a fundamental level that the origin of the very name itself is muddled, other than being an easy way to define a 2D action platformer with an explorable world, as at the time, many action platformers were linear or level-based like Mega Man. The two franchises are much more like classic Mario and Sonic, Battlefield and Call of Duty, Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Moment-to-moment gameplay is similar on a surface level, but so much of the true depth and soul of these games is fundamentally different. Metroidvania is a genre that's difficult to define because so many non-Metroidvanias have elements that could be seen rooting right back to Metroid and Castlevania, and it's not as if they were the first to invent their respective ideas. The major mechanics that make Castlevania stand out from Metroid are the RPG elements that could be found everywhere at the time, from popular tabletop games to classic turn-based home console releases, but the strength of Castlevania came from remixing those elements in a gameplay style that wasn't traditionally associated with them to create something fresh. Metroid didn't invent abilities or upgrades or an explorable 2D world, but the combination of so many different mechanics led to something new and innovative that would only be further refined and perfected with subsequent releases. These two games are worthy of their legendary status and influence because of their intelligent combination of good mechanics and their recognizable personalities. Dark Souls is the next largest innovator of the Metroidvania philosophy of games by taking elements from both isolation, moodiness, game-changing abilities, RPG stats and inventory management, and applying a crushing dark fantasy spin with a focus on difficult boss fights in a 3D world. It's different and influential in a way that very few games achieve. When Castlevania returns, Dark Souls is the most obvious source of inspiration for the team. The difficulty doesn't have to be ramped up completely, but much of the world design, intrigue, and combat that makes up the Soulsborne franchise would feel very fitting for a story about a lone vampire hunter exploring a labyrinthian haunted castle to face larger-than-life monsters and vanquish evil. While the idea of a Metroidvania feels less defined than ever, given the popularity of so many mechanics and what could otherwise be described as non-Metroidvania games, It doesn't change the impact of these classic titles and their legendary place in gaming history. Oversaturating the indie market with Metroid or Castlevania clones will never inspire creativity, not until we take the foundations of these unique franchises and remix them in a way that feels new and exciting, just like they both did decades ago. But given the creativity behind some of the most delightful and charming modern successors, I'm looking forward to the next big idea. From a fellow fan who feels just as inspired by Metroid or Castlevania as I feel, it's time to abandon the Metroidvania because we're ready for something new.